Going to church because you have an illness is not good enough in the eyes of these people back then. And then we have Sarah Good. Sarah had a bumpy life, to say the least. When she was only 17 years old, her father took his own life and left an estate in his will to be divided between the family. His widow, his 2 eldest sons and 7 daughters. When they came of age, Sarah never saw 1 penny of the money. Sarah, after, found happiness and married Daniel Poole. Poole was a former indentured servant, and unfortunately he died sometime after 1682, leaving Sarah with a considerable amount of debt. Sarah remarried William Good, but the debt was too high and eventually they would end up on the streets homeless. And I should also mention that they had a 4-year-old daughter who was also living on the streets with them. And of course, what do you do when you're starving and you're homeless? You beg. You beg for food, warmth, human compassion. Who wouldn't in that situation? Who wouldn't beg for food when you're starving? So that's what she did. She begged for food. But if she was refused food, she would often mutter under her breath and curse her neighbours. She was probably seen as a big nuisance. And muttering and cursing under her breath, or outright to people's faces, this also wouldn't have helped Sarah's case. Because I believe in the eyes of the public, this made Sarah look like she was actually trying to cast some kind of spell on people when they refused her food. Or at least that was the story that was created. Now, I believe Tituba was probably one of the first to be interrogated. Tituba denied all allegations. She said she was no witch. But what we need to remember is that Tituba was a slave. She had no worth to anyone. After all, she was just property, plain and simple. She was an object. Tituba denied over and over that she was a witch, but eventually she would succumb and confess to something she simply didn't do. Now, this is how I imagine it. I imagine her being very, very afraid, knowing that her punishment may be worse, maybe tenfold compared to the punishment of the others, due to her being a different race and being a slave and being worthless. So she spoke after 3 days, an entire 3 days of interrogation. They simply broke her down. It's believed also that Tituba or her husband John had either baked a cake or biscuits. I hear both different versions of that. I hear sometimes it's a cake, sometimes it's biscuits. It is believed that they baked a cake or these biscuits using urine from Elizabeth and Abigail and then fed it to the family dog in hopes of flushing out a witch. Now, how this worked is very unclear. No one actually knows what this practice actually means. I think some people believe that the dog could actually go and find the witch, or I don't know. I know dogs were related in some way to witchcraft and to the devil in those days. Dogs were seen as evil by some people, so maybe it had something to do with that, but no one really knows what kind of outcome they were hoping for there. Anyway, when Samuel found out about this, he was enraged. He believed it was some kind of sin to do black magic, especially in his own home, and he said he was trying to, the way he saw it, they were trying to flush out evil by using evil. And in Samuel's eyes, this was a massive, massive sin. And so it is believed that Tituba was beaten mercifully by Samuel until a confession eventually came out of her. She probably thought it was the only thing to do, otherwise she'd probably be beaten to death. So when the interrogations actually took place, it is believed that she confessed to something she didn't do just to avoid more beatings. She apologised for hurting the girls. She claimed she loved them and wished them no ill treatment, and I can only imagine what was going through her head, having to own up to things she didn't do in hope of being forgiven. And then, probably out of fear or forceful intent, she fabricated a story featuring more witches in Salem, especially Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good. She also dreamt up a story of a tall dark man who visited her and made her sign her name in a book. She signed in red, the colour of blood. She said she saw Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne's names in the book. Tituba also claimed that there was quite a lot more names in the book, although she couldn't see the names clearly, they were blurred. This told people that there were more witches in Salem, and a witch hunt was needed. Now, although all this awful stuff happened to Tituba, she was actually very lucky. She did actually escape the gallows, and she was sent to prison. She spent maybe over a year in prison, and eventually she did just disappear, and so did her husband. Now, it is believed that this may have been thanks to some sympathetic Puritans who may have purchased the two slaves out of guilt for what had happened. But I will say this, from this point on, Tituba totally disappears from the history books. We never hear of her again. We don't know what happened to her or her husband. We don't know who bought her for sure. We don't know where she went after this, but I hope she lived a happy life after this. I really do. I hope she didn't suffer anymore. Now, after being identified as a witch, Sarah Good was one of the first to be interrogated, and as we previously discussed, her attitude towards people who refused her charity wasn't particularly considered mannerful, so already she was unliked, and the way that she did mutter curses to people when they refused the food was actually used as evidence against her. This poor woman who just wanted some food and probably had a few angry words to say to people who refused her food, this was used against her, and it just seems so unfair. Now, what I'm going to tell you, what happened next to Sarah Good, is absolutely disgusting, and it absolutely baffles me that this was allowed to happen. Sarah's little 4-year-old daughter was actually arrested and put in prison with Sarah. This little girl was only 4 years old, and apparently the girls who were apparently possessed by witchcraft claimed that they saw a apparition of the little girl biting and scratching them. Now, this will appear quite a lot throughout the trials. A lot of the evidence given was down to apparitions or spectral images of the defendants, and this was taken as hard evidence. That's how ridiculous this was in those days. Something like that was taken as hard evidence, and it would seem that if you're being accused of a witch, there's basically nothing you can do that will get you off the hook. Whatever ridiculous evidence is given against you, it will be taken seriously. And so, like I said, the little girl was dragged into prison with her mother. She spent well over a year there, and it is believed she was dragged to the courthouse and she was questioned. It is believed the little girl implied her mother was a witch, and that she was seen talking to the devil. And I find it highly, highly improbable that a 4-year-old would dream up these scenarios in her head alone. I'm pretty sure someone put these stories in her head and forced her to say it, probably threatened a 4-year-old little girl to say these things, and then, after she condemned her mother, she was thrown back in prison. It's absolutely disgusting that they did this to anyone, but to a 4-year-old child, it's just terrible. Now, another ridiculous piece of evidence submitted was that the spectral vision, as I just mentioned earlier, of Sarah Good visited the young girls at night, and they even went as far as to act upon this during the trial. Whilst Sarah was trying to plead her innocence, one of the girls screamed out and claimed that the spectral vision of Sarah had actually walked forward to her and stabbed her with a knife right there in the courtroom. And then the girl held up half a broken blade, claiming that this was a knife that she was just stabbed with. However, this was quickly proven incorrect when a man came forward saying he had thrown the knife away the day before, when the blade broke. He also said that the girl who was holding the blade had seen him do so and had obviously gone to retrieve the half-broken knife. The girl in question was given a warning not to lie again, and that was it. She was caught lying, but still Sarah Good's trial still went forward. It would seem Sarah's fate was already sealed. The people had simply made their mind up, and Sarah never once caved under the immense pressure of owning up to be a witch. She didn't even falter when her own husband gave evidence against her. Now remember, these people were living on the streets, they were living rough, they had no money. I'm thinking possibly he was bribed. There's no evidence of this, but it is a possibility. It is a possibility that he may have had dealings with the Putmans, but like I said, this is just speculated. Now, Sarah never showed one shred of remorse, even as they lowered the noose over her head, tightened it around her neck, and took the floor away from underneath her. On July the 19th, Sarah Good was executed. It has also been said that Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter was later released from prison a whole 9 months later. Her father said she was deeply disturbed by the whole experience and has never been the same again, and she was basically good for nothing. That was his words, not mine. After seeing her own mother dragged to the gallows, it was becoming evident that whatever the afflicted girls accused these witches of, it was taken as fact by the court, no matter how little evidence was actually provided. Now next we have Sarah Osborne. Now Elizabeth Hubbard had accused Sarah Osborne of stabbing her with knitting needles whilst in spectral form. As I've said before, this didn't matter how ridiculous it sounded, it was accepted by the court. Now, as I mentioned before, Sarah Osborne hadn't attended church due to illness for quite a few years. This obviously didn't help her case. And once more, I'm going to throw the Putman's name in here once again, because it is said they had a damning amount of say and strong suggestions about the outcome of this woman's case, who was caught up in financial complications with the Putmans. There was possibly a link here between these cases. I would say almost definitely a link, because as you're probably already gathering, the Putman's name does turn up quite a lot in these cases. Sarah was questioned over and over but never once confessed to being a witch, and she also never confessed or accused anyone else of being a witch. Sarah Osborne never saw the noose. She was actually placed in prison, and due to the dire conditions of these prisons, as you can probably imagine in those days, they would not have been nice. They would have been cold, they would have been wet, they would have been rat infested, they would have stunk, they would have been like a public toilet. And due to these conditions, and probably due to her illness that she had, she actually died in prison on May the 10th, 1692. She was believed to be 49 years old. Now, in between all of this, more and more people were being accused of being witches. It was absolutely insane, and it wasn't just women being accused, men were also not safe from accusation. And the gallows that stood on a small mound in Salem was now appropriately named Gallows Hill. And it was said when the witches were hanged, they weren't simply dropped. It was said that the hangings were more like a swinging death rather than a drop. So the noose would have been taken around their neck, and then they would have simply been left to swing back and forth until the long excruciating choke of the noose took the life away. Now, it would seem that there was some sort of pattern emerging. If you didn't follow the Puritan faith, you was a witch. If you didn't follow the uniform structure of appearance and attitude towards the Puritan community, you was a witch. Or simply, if you wasn't liked very much in your community, and since no real evidence was required, anyone could accuse you of being a witch, just purely because they didn't get on with you. Even more so if you was accused by any one of the afflicted girls who were said to be suffering from bewitchment. Now, as I've said, there was quite a lot of accusations, and it's quite impossible to cover every single one of them, but let me tell you about some of the more well-known victims of the Salem Witch Trials. And first on my list is Bridget Bishop. Now, Bridget Bishop was actually one of the first to hang at Salem. I know I covered the other three witches first, but I believe it was important to get their stories covered first because they were the initial three who were accused, but Bridget was the actual first one to hang. Now, little interesting fact, Bridget Bishop had actually been accused of being a witch a mere 12 years prior to the Salem Witch Trials, so this would not have helped her in any way, shape or form. It is believed that during the trials, as she was asked if she was a witch, her accusers, the young girls under bewitchment, started to thrash about and fit uncontrollably. As they did many times when people were about to try and give their side of the story and prove their innocence, the young girls would always seem to start fitting or screaming accusations at the defendant because they wanted to get their own way. And 9 times out of 10, the defendant's plea of innocence was just simply not listened to and thrown out. And that's what happened here. As Bridget was trying to tell her side of the story to plead her innocence, the girls started to thrash about in pain and agony, claiming that Bridget was doing it to them with magic. Bridget denied all the accusations. You see, here's the thing, Bridget didn't ponder to the Puritans' set rules, and this was probably a big mistake. Bridget would wear the kind of clothes that she wanted to wear. She would not be dictated to by anyone. No matter how distasteful these clothes would have looked, well, how distasteful they would have looked in the eyes of people in 1692 in Salem. She was a loud woman, she liked to drink, and she was actually the owner of 2 taverns as well, so she had property